Okay, so if you want the information of what we've already gone through, you can get that on my Patreon. It's all sitting there. Please feel free to put questions or thoughts or anything in the comment section, and we will jump into those, as soon as we can. Again, we're talking about Brunswick stew and food, like telling this story. So the first thing I really wanted to do for our lab today is to clarify that. So I have a degree in home economics, taught home economics, and consider myself a community home economist. Hello, Kenyatta. Kimmy K. Sorry. Hi. Hello, Melly. So one of the things that I love to do is to educate and teach about home economics, but through the lens of intersectionality. So when we're talking about home economics and care for the home here in these United States, we have to talk about it through an intersectional lens because the domestic tasks for this country were handed out to the enslaved population, Black Americans, Africans, who were brought here during enslavement, and all people all over the world, globally, when one group oppresses another group, um, they hand that oppressed group their domestic tasks. That is not special to the United States. That is globally. The cleaning, cooking, caring for children, laundry, um, all of the things that are domestic work, that kind of labor is given to oppressed populations by the population that is oppressing. Um, and that has to do with how we have established ourselves, humanity, how we established communities when we first started establishing communities, which was back in Mesopotamia when we initially stopped being nomadic as a species. When we stopped being nomadic and we started planting crops and we started being in control of our food, then we began to have a surplus of resources, and that began a power dynamic that has resulted in how we function, societal patterns, and how we function. I talk about that at length in the lesson, and you can see the live again on my Patreon that I did where I talked about it, and all the other content and things and readings that support all of this and all the research. So labor, domestic tasks are given to oppressed populations. So when we're talking about home economics, when we're talking about what happens in the home domestically, domestic labor, and when we're doing all of that conversation in America, we have to talk about it through an intersectional lens if we're going to have if we're going to have fidelity in that conversation and have a really robust dialogue about it, we have to talk about it through an intersectional lens because it matters. It ties into the, thank you for the hearts, thank you so much. It ties into the the conversation and how we approach domestic tasks in the country, how we talk about it, how we've historically talked about it. Why the way that Black people approach domestic tasks is drastically different than the way that white people approach domestic tasks, drastically different than the way that um, other groups, people of color, approach domestic tasks. And all of that matters because there's a dialogue and an idea around domestic tasks. And if you're looking at them through a Western lens, then you are looking at them through the lens of white supremacy. And it just kind of is what it is, right? And the sooner we can accept that it is what it is, we can actually back off of it and look at it objectively and then approach it differently. Education conversation. I learned a lot from your videos. Oh, thank you so much. Education conversation. I love making the videos, and I appreciate y'all who engage with them and watch them, listen to me run my mouth. I really do appreciate it. So Brunswick stew, which is this picture behind me, is one of those um, very interesting dishes that actually really embodies this idea of invisible labor and cultural and societal patterns. So I wanted to start with food. Obviously, home economics is so much more than food, but food is one of those things that is so common. If I started with textiles or I started with industrial or interior design or like architecture, like how we gather in spaces, I think it would be a little less of a thing to gather around. So we are starting with food specifically. We are starting with soup. We're starting with soups and stews because soup is one of the things that when we started organizing ourselves into communities in Mesopotamia, and we started planting crops, and we started um, living in communities, we started making soup. And in the comments, with somebody, anybody, take a guess. If you know, fine. If you don't, take a guess. What technological um, advancement empowered us to be able to make soup, to be able to really start making soup? Uh, Anybody have any ideas why in Mesopotamia, once we started planting crops and started living less nomadically, and we ended up with a community, why was soup one of the things that showed up as a meal for us? What technological advancement empowered that? Any ideas? Hello, whatever, Whitney. Hello, Johnny. Hello, Kathy. Anybody have any ideas about what technological advancement empowered us to start making soup as a species? Why did humans start making soup? It's okay if you're wrong. Listen, this is not a have to be right place. Okay? It's not that. So feel free to throw anything in. Hi, Peaches. Hello, Mr. Jim. Hello, Kathy. Hello. Hi, Yana. Healing. Like soup. Like we wanted to heal. Is that it? Metal work. Okay, metallurgy. Thank you. Education conversation. Yep. And soup is healing. That is making pots. Education conversation. Um, okay. Thank you. Yep. Thank you for that. So definitely, yes, soup is healing, and it's one of those meals that we first started making because you can get a lot of nutrients out of it. It can go a long way. You can boil those bones, pull out those minerals right into that soup, and have a really delicious and nutritious meal made out of not a whole lot of anything. You can also, my brother walking with pots. He said that's how we started. Yep, people making pots. Yep. And so prior to making pots, prior to metalwork, prior to metalwork, we end up with soup because of the wheel, because of being able to make clay. Because of being able to make clay, we end up, hello, husband. Hi, Michaela. We end up being able to make pottery. So because we have a wheel and we can then use that wheel to make pottery, we end up with clay pots that we can boil substances in, that we can make soup in. And eventually we do end up learning how to, when we get to the Bronze Age, this is during the Stone Age, when we get to the Bronze Age and we start working with metal and metallurgy, we start making pots and we have something a little more resistant, a little more resilient to be able to make soup in. But prior to that, we are making soup in clay pots because we learned how to make pottery because we ended up with the wheel. Prior to that, people are making soup still, but they're making it in like with hot stones. So they're like heating up stones and then putting all the ingredients and everything into like the stomach of an animal, dropping those stones in there and letting the stones kind of heat up the soup that's in the stomach. But obviously those don't last long. You're not gonna be able to get a bunch of meals out of them. So once we start making pottery, then we start ending up with soup that is more robust. Now, the interesting thing about it, and that's part of, we're still talking about Brunswick stew. The interesting thing about that is sometimes when we think about things historically, we kind of look at them through the lens of what we have going on right now. But that is not the case. Those pots, the ceramics, all of those things that were created for the community. There was one big old pot. Not everybody had a set of pots. So individual families were not making a individual pot of soup. Soup is that first communal meal. It's the first communal meal of humanity, soup and bread. Because once we started planting grains, we started making a very, very, very rustic version of bread, and soup comes really right along with bread. Bread and soup kind of hang out together. So we end up with a communal pot, this big old pot, and everybody is getting a bowl out of that pot, right? And that is our beautiful, and I love it. I love the imagery. I love the idea of it because it's this beautiful example of what humanity, like our initial thoughts, like our initial approach to like living in cooperation, living creatively, you know, that kind of thing. And of course, during this time, we are very much concerned with our own preservation. We're concerned with making sure that we have enough food. We're concerned with making sure we understand the natural world around us because it was a very dangerous place. A lot of things could happen to you in a real short amount of time. And we were very concerned about figuring out how to live safely with one another. And we lived in cooperation, in deep cooperation with one another. So the soup pot, the bread making is, I think, a beautiful example of how we initially started engaging in community with one another once we started living in communities. So Brunswick stew, which again is what's pictured here, is an example of a soup that kind of comes out of that. So I have some notes here, so that's what I'm looking at because I want to move through this. Hello, Bernice. How are you doing? Please feel free to put questions or comments or thoughts in the in here. You never know what somebody else doesn't know, and you never know the aha moment you're having might inspire an aha moment for somebody else. So I love for my comment section to be a resource, to be a place where people can walk away with some ideas that makes their lives a little bit better, a little bit easier. Okay, so please feel free to throw that into the comment section. When we were talking about Brunswick stew as a case study, one of the things that I want to make sure that we kind of look at. Hold on, let me back up here a little bit. So we're talking about food is more than just sustenance, right? As we talked about home as a place of liberation, as a place of resistance, because home is a place where we learn how to behave in society, right? Societal patterns are created by individuals' core values and individual beliefs, and societies inform themselves and are informed by themselves. So when we're talking about home and we're looking at it a little bit differently, we're looking at soup and Brunswick stew specifically a little bit differently as well. We're looking at it as a case study in food history and labor and resourcefulness, as a record of history, labor, and cultural survival. Because domestic labor has always been an act of both oppression and resilience. Because here's the thing, whenever a group of people are oppressed, they are going to resist that eventually. People don't stay oppressed. They do something about it because we don't like it. So Brunswick stew is an example of that, and we're getting into that. So one of the first things I want to talk about is how Brunswick stew is shaped, how we got here. So let me ask this question. Anybody seen this before? This kind of soup? Anybody? And this is I'm trying to figure out how to frame this. Brunswick stew is one of those dishes that if you go to, so you know how, okay, you go to someone's house or someone comes to your house and they're cooking food that they grew up eating. I always say that the story of food in an area or a place is actually found in the leftovers in people's refrigerator. It's not found at the restaurants and on the restaurant menus, right? So if we go to a restaurant in a specific area or place where people eat there's a culture that's happening there, and we look at what's on the menu, it's good. There's going to be cultural food on that menu, but we're going to get a very different cultural information, cultural data if we look at the leftovers in people's refrigerators, things that they cooked in their refrigerator. Why? Because these are the foods that they grew up eating. These are the foods that were in their home of origin, right? These are the foods that they learned from their community. So the leftovers in people's refrigerators are really much more interesting than the dishes that are on the recipe, or not the recipe, on the menu, right? In a specific cultural restaurant, right? Brunswick stew is an example of that. This is something that you will find in the refrigerators of Black folks. Is Brunswick stew, and that's why it's such an important dish that, again, if we're not talking about it, then we won't know, right? So any thoughts about that? Again, feel free to put that in the comment section. If you can think of a dish that's like that, that's like, this is something that people eat in their homes, but they don't it's not necessarily going to be on a list of foods for this culture, right? But this culture definitely eats it, and it is a very, very hard. It is a very, very hard stew. So I'm wondering, and I ask people about Brunswick stew all the time because I find it to be, again, one of those fascinating dishes that I grew up eating this. Anybody here grow up, and you don't have to be Black to be clear. I want to be clear. It's not about you being Black or any race or ethnicity. You don't have to be any of those things. Did you grow up, or anybody in your family, making or eating a tomato-based soup or stew that has like beans and corn in it? Beans, corn, tomato based with some kind of meat. But if you can't find the leftovers because they eat it all up, in my home, dairy dies in the fridge. I hope that works out for you. I do. So dairy dying in the fridge, y'all. That's not okay. I can't even. Hold on. Why did that happen? Swipe left to close. Well, I'm still learning how to use Loud, guys. I'm so sorry. BB Bobby. So, that's my husband, y'all, cutting up in the comment section. That's it. He's cutting up. BB Biden. So yes, so you had something like this. Chili. Okay, yes, education. Yeah, chili would be a kind of with the same sort of like base as Brunswick stew. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Again, it's broth. It's like a tomato brothy kind of stew. It has corn and beans in it. And I have asked people, I go all kinds of places for all kinds of reasons, and I ask people about, did you grow up with something like this? Did you grow up eating something like this? And a lot of times, yeah, I did. We called it this or we called it that. For me growing up, this is just called soup. It's just called soup. When my mother says, oh, it's getting cold out, I think I'm gonna make a pot of soup, this is what she's talking about. It is this exact soup right here. It's this. There's another picture of it. It's that. Oh, it's getting cold out. I think I'm a make a pot of soup. She's talking about this, and I never knew that it was called Brunswick stew. I never knew. I didn't find out that it was called Brunswick stew until 2 years ago, a year ago. Let me think about this. Maybe it was 2 years ago. With my aunt. So my mother is one of 11, and my grandparents were sharecroppers in Virginia, and they had a farm and raised hogs and lived in the country. And I spent my summers with my grandparents. My mother, like I said, one of 11, she migrated as part of the Great Migration from Virginia to D.C. In the second wave of the Great Migration. And her and my father are both from Virginia. And my grandmother, my aunts who are the wives of my uncles, all can the base of this. And I think I have a picture. There it is. They all can it. See that jar right there? That is the base of Brunswick stew. That's the base of this soup. They all can it. So if you go into their houses and you look at their canning shelves, right? They pressure can it or water bath can it. And you look at their canning shelves, you're going to see a jar like this that has tomatoes, corn, and lima beans in it. And it is the base for soup. And that's all anybody has ever called it in my family, pot of soup. If my mother's making chicken noodle, right, chicken and dumplings, she doesn't really make dumplings, but chicken and noodles or something, she calls it that. If she's making navy beans with ham, she calls it that. But if she says, I'm making a pot of soup, full stop, this is what she's talking about. And the story behind that is very interesting. So, they, like I said, they can the base. When anybody gets sick, you get a jar of this in my family. You say, oh, you need a pot of soup. You need a pot of soup. My mother is recovering right now. She's in rehab. I'm in the Midwest. I live on the East Coast, but I'm in the Midwest and been here since the end of November. My brother and I flew out. She was here visiting my brother who lives here and my niece. Like my brother, his whole family live in the Midwest. She was here visiting them for Thanksgiving. She got sick, ended up in the hospital. My brother and I, who live near her on the East Coast, flew out here. We had been here about a week. She was very, very ill. And she had just like woken up. And she was, were we still in the hospital? I think we had gotten to rehab by then. It looks good. It looks good. Listen, my sister, I'm saying it all. It's delicious. It tastes better than it looks. Okay. But anyway, so my mom, when she got into rehab and she was kind of able to start eating, my brother turned to me. He said, "You know what she needs? She needs some soup." And I knew exactly what he was talking about. She needs some soup. And I came to my niece's house and I made this. I made a pot of soup and took it to my mother. And when that broth hit them lips, she was like, "Yes, it's so good. It's exactly what I needed." And she ate and ate and ate and ate. If anybody has a tickle in their throat or anything, pronounced like my aunt sister, is that right? I'm still messing that up. My aunt sister. Okay. Thank you. Listen, it's quite honestly, it's nothing that thank you. I'm glad I got it. Okay. It's nothing that my mother wouldn't have done for me if I had a tickle in my throat. She shows up at my doorstep all the time. My kids will call her. She'll say, "Oh, you sound like that. What's going on, honey? You sound a little okay. You need you need to take some Tylenol. You need to lay down. You need to drink some water." I don't know why they think Tylenol laying down in water is going to fix it. They do. That's what she'll say. And then she'll show up later with this. "Hey, Danita, I left some soup on the porch." I know exactly it's that. Okay. So what happened? So a year ago, my father passed away, and it was right after he had passed. It was really cold, and I was like, I just need to cook. I was just working through my grief, and I was like, I just need to cook. So I pulled out my pots and I said, I'm going to make a pot of soup. I really didn't know what I was going to cook initially, but I knew it was going to be a pot of something hot and warm and comforting. And so I ended up saying, well, I'm going to make some kind of soup. And I grabbed this book right here in the corner, Sweet Home Cafe. Um, um, that right there. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And the recipe. So listen, we're going to talk about the recipe in just a second because I have some thoughts about that, but we are going to go through it. So this book right here, Sweet Home Cafe, has a recipe. This is it right here for Brunswick stew. I have whited out the actual recipe because we need to pay people for their stuff. And this book, Sweet Home Cafe, comes from the Smithsonian African American Heritage Museum. I'm saying that wrong. African American Ashton. Yes. Give me the full name? African American. American History and Culture. National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you. It comes from, they have a cafe in there called Sweet Home Cafe. And in this book, they lay out recipes from different regions in the country. The South, West, and foods that come from there that are African American foods. Brunswick stew is in the book. The day that I said I'm going to cook something, I pulled out this cookbook and I'm thumbing through it. And I was looking for a recipe to say, this is something I'm going to cook. And I saw Brunswick stew. I never connected that the soup that I had grown up eating, that my mother has always made when she said she's going to make soup, was Brunswick stew. We never had a name for it. We just always called it soup. And I'm looking through the ingredients, and I'm like, hold on. I know what this is. Corn, lima beans, tomatoes, broth, some kind of meat or protein, and it calls for rabbit. Brunswick stew was originally made with squirrel. And I'll tell the story of Brunswick stew in just a second. But yeah, I'm looking at it and I'm like, potatoes. What? this is my mother's soup. What in the world? This and I'm like stirring the pot as I'm actually making it. So I was blown away to know that this soup has a name. Now, why is it that right, as a daughter of sharecroppers from Virginia, right, black folks from, why didn't I know that this was called Brunswick stew? Why is that? Why? And then as I began to research it, I started to understand exactly why. I had no idea that this had a name. Um, so let's do the story of Brunswick stew, and then I will share how that happened. Does that work? Um, and in terms of the actual recipe, the recipe is here in Sweet Home Cafe. I have shared the recipe for Brunswick stew. Um, it is on my Substack, but I do have it behind a paywall. I do, and I will tell you why. I have it behind a paywall because it is a culturally important recipe. And one of the things that is really important to me as a community home economist is one, sharing the stories of Black people, marginalized people, indigenous people, right? Sharing our food stories, because I just think it's really important to not only share the story, but to also credit the story and to um, be really, really respectful of culturally important recipes. I do. I don't. I don't think that. What am I trying to say? Fusion foods, things like that, absolutely fine. I have no issue with that. Have at it. You want to tweak the recipe? Go for it. You want to make it your own? Absolutely. But first, let's start with the recipe as it was written, the way it was intended, and let's credit the people who created the recipe, and let's always credit them. So when I see recipes, and I actually wrote about this on my Substack because of a New Year's article. New Good Luck Soup was the name of the article, and I took issue with it. And I did write about it on my Substack because it's something that just needs to be addressed. With a writer on Substack, a food writer on Substack, talked about the good luck foods that Black people eat on New Year's Day and how they were like superstitious, kind of silly foods. And they reimagined these foods that they grew up eating because they're from the South. They are white, they're from the South. They grew up eating these foods. And they reimagined it and put the good luck foods into a curry and made a curry soup with the good luck foods. And I was like, because we have to credit culturally important foods. It's just the right thing to do. It's culturally important. You can reimagine it so long as you properly credit it. And you can, I think it's also important to pay attention to the fact that like curry has its own stuff with it. It has its own, right? So I say all that to say I'm not sharing the recipe just out in the world because it is a culturally important food. But if you want to carry the story of Brunswick stew and the enslaved gentleman who created this soup and has not been credited for it, I'm going to share his story today. Please, if you want to carry that story and share it, and if you want to cook it and serve it to people, it is on my Substack for minimal dollars and cents. But I do have the paywall there because I want people to grab it who are really going to steward the story, credit it, and share it and just cherish it. So but the article is there, the background is there, everything else is available to anybody, completely free, completely available. Okay, so I know I took a long way around to get to that explanation, but I just wanted to be really, really clear about it. Okay, so Brunswick stew. Of course, I started researching it because my dad, when I was working through grief with my father's passing, and I made this soup, and I realized this is the soup I've been eating my whole life. What is Brunswick stew, and where did it come from? I found that Brunswick stew is kind of in two different places. Some people credit it in Virginia, and some people credit it in Georgia. But even that confusion is really housed in the erasure of the culinary genius of Black people. It really is. Because today, if you look up stew masters, Brunswick stew is a whole thing. It's sold in restaurants. It is sold canned in grocery stores. this soup that I've been eating, hey, Will, um, oh, hey now, is that Marlon? Hey now. So this soup that I grew up eating is actually sold in restaurants. It is sold canned in grocery stores. It has been commodified and commercialized completely, and it is not credited to Mr. Matthews, um, who was the enslaved cook of a state delegate in Virginia, and that's where this soup comes from. Um, and I am pulling up my Substack now. Um, Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm just getting over to it. So, in researching to find out more about the soup and where it came from, because again, I'm sitting around eating it and had no idea that it had a name, that it was a Brunswick stew. I learned these things about the actual soup. So, um, it is the gentleman's name is Mr. James or Uncle Jimmy Matthews. Is the gentleman, the enslaved gentleman who created Brunswick stew, who created this. So what happens is he is out. He is enslaved by Dr. Creed Haskins. I'm looking at my notes. I'm saying people's names right. He's enslaved by Dr. Creed Haskins, Mr. Matthews, and he is the enslaved cook for this politician. I don't know if Mr. Matthews was a planter in that he had a large farm, but we do know that he considered himself to be an owner of enslaved people, and he would regularly have these gatherings of to go out hunting with his friends, and he was again a state delegate, and this is in 1820s, almost 1830s. So Mr. Matthews, again, is the enslaved cook for Dr. Creed Haskins. Hey, Kayla. Hey, now. And Haskins decides, finally caught my laugh. I'm so glad you caught it. I'm so glad. So I'm talking about, okay, Kima, let me ask you, okay, in your family, do you have a tomato-based soup that has corn and beans and lima beans, maybe some other bean, but it's tomatoes, corn, beans, maybe potatoes that your family cooks, and it's just a soup that everybody eats, everybody cooks it, you've been eating it your whole life? I ask this question all the time, and that's for anybody. It's for anybody listening to the live. If you have that soup, just put it in the comments. Yeah, I know that y'all might call it something different than Brunswick stew. Like I said, in my family, it is just called soup. No, not in my family, but my roots are in Arkansas. So I was in Indiana, Gary, Indiana, and I was talking to folks who said that they do have this soup, but it has a couple different, but it's the base of this soup right here. But it's a little bit different. So I wonder if that's the same in Arkansas. So now let me write a note. My grandma does. She does an okra tomato. Exactly. In some places, okra is added to it. Exactly. My mother, my grandmother didn't eat okra, and it also depends on whether or not okra was available. My family's from Virginia, and my father-in-law sends it over, so they'll beef stew. Exactly. My mother sends it over, and some people just call it beef stew, but beef stew is a little bit different than this. And Black people, when we make it, it is Brunswick stew. It's a version of Brunswick stew, which is different than beef stew. Okay, so I want to look up Arkansas. What was going on with Arkansas and this tomato soup? Okay, so Mr. Haskins, the delegate, he gets his friends together and they go hunting. And they'll all, gather their little bits of this, that, and the other and go on hunting trips. So this is a hunting trip that he's going on. And he decides this time that he's going to take Uncle Jimmy. This is James Matthews, the enslaved person at Dr. Haskins at his home. So he gets his people together. They all pack up and they head out to go hunting on this hunting trip. And Hampton Roads, oh, okay. So my family is from, I just had a brain fart, like Stony Creek. Petersburg, Stony Creek area, Waverly, Emporia, that area. So they all get together and they go out to hunt, right? They get to the camping area where they're gonna go hunting, and they all set up. Uncle Jimmy, the enslaved cook, he stays. Jimmy Matthews, he stays behind while they go out to hunt. And again, this is late 1820s. So whatever they hunt, whatever they capture, they're gonna eat. That's dinner. So we can't run out and get a burger. We're gonna eat. We're gonna eat whatever is captured. So um, they end up going out to hunt. They're gone for a long time. When they come back, Mr. Matthews, Uncle Jimmy, has a pot going of stew. Has a pot going of stew. They say, well, what is that? Because we went out hunting. So what's in this pot? Because we're supposed to be eating whatever we get, whatever we, capture out here. Well, here's the thing. They didn't come back with a thing. They went hunt. They didn't come back with a thing. They didn't have not a fowl, not a haul, nothing. They came back empty-handed. Okay, so they're all sitting around starving, right? Hungry as they want to be. They didn't catch anything. They come back, and Brother Jimmy, Mr. Matthews, has this pot going of this stew. They don't want to eat it because when they asked, "What is it?" he said, "Squirrel." He said, "Squirrel." It's squirrel because I was hungry. So it's squirrel, guys. That's what you're eating. Hey, Gabriel. So I'm talking about grandma's soup. So they said, no, we don't want to eat that because it's squirrel. We don't eat squirrel. We don't eat rodents. We don't eat rodents. You can eat the rodents, Jimmy. You can eat that whole pie because we're not going to touch it because it's rodents. We want to eat beef, quail, some kind of bird that they found. Just asked my mama, and she said my grandma used to make a beef stew. I'm telling you, listen. I'm telling you, it's going to be tomato based. It's going to have corn, a bean, like a lima bean or something in it. Those two are going to be some kind of bean and corn and something green, okra, green. My mother puts string beans in it, right? Right. Like I said, tomato based. I'm telling, and it's not as simple as beef stew. It's going to be, it's brothier than beef stew. And I'm telling you, we eat it and we don't even know the story about it. In our families, we've been passing it to each other forever. Okay. So they said we don't want to eat that because we don't eat rats. We don't eat rodents. We don't want to eat that. He said, no problem. Don't worry about it. I'll eat it. And they sat over there hungry as they want to be. Well, the hunger finally got to them. They finally said, well, ain't nobody out here. Won't nobody see us eat this slave food. Nobody's going to see us eat these rodents. Okay? Hunt possum, bird, squirrel, even Mr. Exactly. A lot of times this is made with rabbit. My mother makes it with chicken, beef. You can make it with, and that's one of the beautiful things about it. You can make it with any protein, right? It's going to be delicious either way. But a lot of times it's made with rabbit. But Jimmy Matthews, when he created this dish, he made it with squirrel. They finally sat there and got hungry enough to say, well, listen, nobody's going to know if we eat this slave food. So give us a bowl, Jimmy. We'll try it. We'll try it. They took one bite. And said, this is the most delicious thing I've ever had. It's the most delicious thing I've ever had. They ate the entire pot. They ate the whole thing. They ate the entire pot of stew that Brother Matthews created out there from nothing. And what I find fascinating about this, because then they are so impressed with this enslaved gentleman's pot of soup. They are so impressed with it that they have him make it again when they get back from the hunting trip, and they have him make it 3 or 4 more times. Everyone who tastes it is so impressed with this soup. They are so impressed with it that when Andrew Jackson is running for president, they bring Mr. Matthews to his one of his large campaign events and have him make this soup for Andrew Jackson, the future president of these United States. Okay? The future president of these United States. Tyson, is that Joe? Your soup came out of a can. Stop it. Um, they 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 have him make it, and he is cooking for now because remember, what's his name? Creed Haskins is a state delegate. So now they're cooking for all of these political people, and they are eating this soup up, eating it up, to the point where eventually it becomes known as Mr. Haskins soup, the delegate, not Uncle Jimmy, the enslaved gentleman, Mr. Matthews. It's not his soup. It's not his soup. It's the delegate soup, and they name it Brunswick stew. Now, some people will say, no, it comes from Georgia, from Brunswick, something, something in Georgia. But the documented presence of this soup is from Virginia, from Mr. Matthews, Creed Haskins, who owned Mr. Matthews, who was the enslaved cook at Creed Haskins Plantation, who created this soup, Brunswick stew. Very little, exactly. And that's the point. The labor, the hard work of Black Americans, that's the point. That the labor is invisible. When you look at this, right? Because again, Black people, we've been eating this for forever. Like I said, we all call it something different. It's got something different in it, right? It's got a little bit of variation, but the bones of it are the same. It's not beef. It's not beef stew. If you just go and get a regular beef stew, it's going to be a little bit different from this, right? But the labor is invisible. We don't see Mr. Matthews in this. Not only that, Creed Haskins gets credited with the recipe, with the soup. And I write about this. It's in my Substack article. If you go to Substack, you'll see it's right there. It's available. There's no barrier to entry. Like I said, the recipe is behind a paywall because it is a culturally important recipe, and I'm not going to give that away. I want that to be in the hands of people who want to steward it, who are going to credit Mr. Matthews when they make it for their friends. Like in my mind, people will hear the story of Mr. Matthews and Brunswick stew. They will see this beautiful soup, this tasty, tasty dish, and they'll say, you know what? I am going to make a pot of Brunswick stew for my family, and we're going to sit around the table and we're going to talk about Mr. Matthews while we eat this, right? So those are the people who I want to have the recipe because it's culturally important. So it is behind a paywall for a nominal amount, but that's where the recipe is. And it is not a recipe in the traditional sense. I have written it as a cooking at the elbow. That's what I call it, cooking at the elbow, a non-recipe recipe. This is the thing you learn when you learn to cook in the kitchen with your mother. You were at her elbow, your aunt's elbow. You were at your grandmother's elbow. That's how you learned how to cook, not through a written recipe. And I know sometimes we get a little funny about our elders won't give out their recipes. They won't tell us how they made blah, 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 XYZ. There's a whole thing there. Tap the screen. Am I supposed to do that? Crystal? Tap the screen. I tapped it. I don't know if I was supposed to do that. But there's a whole thing, right, around our recipes or older people not providing their recipes. But the thing is, it's because that's not the tradition. The tradition is an oral history done at the elbow. We need to like the live. Oh, thank you, Crystal. Thank you. Crystal goes live, right? I have known Crystal since I was 18. She goes live regularly. This is my sister from another sister. So she is my live expert. I don't know a whole lot about going live on TikTok. I get on here and run my mouth. This is my first time doing Green Screen Live. Anyway, in my heart, people will hear about the story. They will want to learn how to make Brunswick stew so they can share the stew and they can share the story of Mr. Matthews, the enslaved cook, who has not been credited with this delicious culinary absolute giant. It's a culinary giant, right? Where else are people making this? Folk are making money off Brunswick stew. They are canning it. People started putting Brunswick stew on restaurant menus. So this happened in 1828. People started putting Brunswick stew on restaurant menus in like 1835, something like that. And not crediting this man, not crediting this culinary genius with this soup. Okay? So in my mind, people will get the recipe, learn to cook at my elbow through the demo, because the demo is there, and then make it like have a dinner party with Brunswick stew and a little piece of cornbread. Don't that sound good? Have a dinner party with Brunswick stew and share the story of Mr. Matthews. That's what's in my heart for this story. Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about the indigenous influence that shows up in this, because that is super, super, super important. The indigenous influence in the soup. So if you've been here for a little bit, thank you for sending all the things. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Dinner party with dishes created by the. Listen, that would be, yes, yes. I want people running around saying, listen, I have to make this. It's called Brunswick stew. Let me tell you the story and credit this gentleman, this culinary genius. Okay. Hey, Dumpling, that's my great nephews just got down from school. So the indigenous influence. Okay, so when Mr. Matthews, right, when he made his pot of Brunswick stew, he made it with squirrel. Caught some squirrels, okay, cleaned them up, got them together, put them in the pot, and cooked it. He thickened his soup with bread, stale bread that he had, butter, and some other herbs and things in his original pot of Brunswick stew that he made out there. Because again, he made this because he knew the people that Dr. Haskins, who was his owner, the group of men he got together to go take hunting. This is how I imagine it happening in my head. Uncle Jimmy, as the enslaved cook, said, "Oh, okay, so Mr. Haskins, who is coming hunting? Who do I need to prepare for this hunting trip? Because I'm cooking for him. So who do I need to prepare for?" And Mr. Haskins said, "I'm bringing Fred, James, and Clifford hunting. That's who's coming. Me, Fred, James, and Clifford." And Mr. Uncle Jimmy said, "Oh, okay." Uncle Jimmy said, "Oh, okay, got it. Okay, no problem. So we'll be ready." But he was thinking, okay, Fred, James, Clifford, and Creed Haskins, the man who thinks he owns me, they can't shoot worth nothing. We're gonna sit out there and starve. These they can't catch a thing. Last time we went out, they didn't catch a thing. If they couldn't have caught something, if it had run up and jumped onto their nets and their traps, we ain't gonna eat nothing. So when they got to the place where they were hunting and they set up camp and they left to go hunt, he was like, "I'm not gonna sit there and starve. I'm not sitting there and starve. So let me set my traps for these squirrels." Because his knowledge of who he was out there with and where they were, like, because they were on the Chesapeake Bay, his knowledge of that, he said, "They're not gonna catch a thing. They don't know how to hunt worth anything. But I'm gonna make sure that I eat." So he got them squirrels together and made this Brunswick stew. When they came back, they said, "We don't eat rats." Hey, Davina. Hey, now. Thanks for joining. Thank you. They said, "We don't eat rats and squirrels." He said, "Okay, we'll be hungry." And they said, "Well, we are hungry, so let me go ahead and let me get a bowl." And then they loved it. They loved it. Okay. So the indigenous influence. So this does start to, when brother Uncle Jimmy gets back to the place where there are more resources, gets back from the hunting trip, he does adjust the soup a little bit. He does adjust it. And what ends up happening is the soup starts to show up, right, with his adjustments. What are the adjustments? Because remember, he started with squirrel, butter, and bread. What are the adjustments? All of a sudden, the soup now has corn and lima beans in it. Well, how? Why? Why? How did that happen? This is the indigenous influence. This is the native indigenous influence that happens in the soup because there's this shared knowledge, this shared culinary knowledge that happens between Africans, between Black Americans, and indigenous people who are we're on their land. Indigenous folks who are around, because again, this happens in the Chesapeake, Virginia, but on the Chesapeake. So we have indigenous people there, we know, right? And we see corn and beans show up. Why is that? Corn, beans, right? Because of the three sisters, right? Because of the three sisters. Anybody know who the three sisters are? If you do, put it in the comments if you know who the three sisters are, from indigenous culinary, indigenous foodways. Anybody know? The three sisters. Yep, exactly. Squash, corn, and some kind of bean, right? So quinoa, celery, onions, and garlic. So that is a three part. I get how your mind went there. That is like a mirepoix. That is French, celery, onions, and garlic. Those aromatics that come together. The Holy Trinity, in New Orleans would be celery, onions, and green peppers. The mirepoix, celery, onions, and carrots. So those are your core aromatics, like root vegetables, aromatics, right? So I get why your mind went there. But the three sisters in Native American culinary foodways is corn, lima beans, corn, beans, and squash, and they are all grown together. In Native American agriculture, corn is the stalk in the middle, right? The beans are crawling plants, so they'll climb up the corn, and the squash is like big leaves, right? And right, we make succotash out of it, exactly. The squash is the big leaves that kind of spread out around the ground to provide some ground cover for the other things that are growing. So the three sisters, tell them your secret now. What is my secret? Right, you have to tell. I don't know what you're talking about. So the three sisters. Oh, that I made succotash for. I know what you're talking about. For Thanksgiving this year. Oh, Indigenous. Uh, uh, for Indigenous uh, Observance Day, otherwise known as that I'm Native American. I made succotash. Anyway, my grandmother and her mother fix corn, beans, and squash all the time. They're from North Carolina. Exactly. That is Native American. That is Native American culinary knowledge that is shared. West African tradition. So that's what we have here in Brunswick Stew. We have the marriage of Native American culinary knowledge, West African culinary knowledge, all coming together in one pot, and that's why it's delicious. That's why it's delicious. So Native Americans will plant the three sisters together: corn, squash, and beans, right? They always plant them together because one, they grow well together. Two, if you plant one by itself, it can pull all the nutrients out of the soil, and you end up with soil that you can't continue to use, and your yield will go down every year. And that has to do with us not being nomadic any longer. I talked about that with Mesopotamia and us starting to live in communities. So that means we're planting in the same places, and we have to then attend to the soil. Native Americans understood this, and so that's why they planted the three sisters together, and they planted like in a circle. So when we see corn and beans show up together in Brunswick stew, which is an African American dish, we see it show up like that for a very specific reason. Let's back up a little bit to the colonies, the initial colonization of North America. And we had that first round. Hey, Keisha. We had that first round of colonial folks show up here, and they died. I mean, that's what happened. They died because they couldn't feed themselves, right? Native Americans attempted to give them some agricultural knowledge, but they couldn't be bothered, and so they could not feed themselves until they died. The second group that comes, right, they don't die because they do some agricultural and things like that, but they don't listen either. They don't listen either. And they end up with a disease called pellagra. Bleeding gums, it's bad. Teeth falling out, it's bad. It's bad. Why do they get pellagra? Why? Why is that? Why is that? Anybody know why folks got pellagra? They end up with pellagra because they do not listen to the Native American culinary knowledge of how to handle corn malnutrition. They are not able to pull the niacin out of corn. They're not able to pull it out. And this also ties back to Wonder Bread, which, Kim, I know you know where I'm getting ready to go with that. This ties back to Wonder Bread. I know we're talking about colonial, but it ties back to Wonder Bread. Because they're not able to pull the niacin out of corn, and they're eating so much corn, right? But Native Americans told them, you can't just eat corn. Can't do that. Oh, thank you. Listen, I'm just trying to get my little life together. I don't mind telling you. So the Native American folks told them, you can't just eat corn. You need to eat corn, and you need to treat corn through a process called nixtamalization. Okay? nixtamalization allows corn to be broken down a little bit before you ingest it. This is where we get hominy from, right? Before you ingest it, so that you can pull out the nutrients in it, so you don't end up with something like pellagra. But because they didn't want to be bothered with learning about nixtamalization, they ate corn without fully processing it. Your body can't break it down on its own. That's one point. There's a second point. The second point is beans are a protein source. Yay! Right, we hear that all the time. Eat your beans because they're a great source of protein. They're a great source of protein. Make sure you eat your beans. They're a great source of protein. But here's what indigenous people know. West African indigenous people, African indigenous people, like all over, right? Native American, indigenous people know this. This is what they know. They know that if you just eat beans, you're not going to get a complete protein, because beans don't have all the amino acids that you need in order to have a complete protein. Beans have enough amino acids for you to have a partial protein, but not a complete one. In order to have a complete protein, you need to eat beans with corn. You need to eat beans with rice. You need to eat beans with whole grains. You can't just do one on its own. You need both of them. So the Three Sisters is part of the Native American culinary knowledge. It's also part of the West African culinary knowledge, right? That's part of the tomato. So we're eating. This is why this soup that shows up in Black families and on Black tables has corn and lima beans in it, corn and navy beans, corn and pinto beans. It's gonna have a bean in it and it's gonna have a corn in it, right? Because those two things together give you a complete protein, and the corn has been treated so you can get all the nutrients out of it. That's the Native American influence here that Mr. Matthews pulls into the recipe. Now, the tomato base, where does that come from? So tomatoes, interestingly enough, are actually from the Aztecs. Tomatoes are from, I should have asked first so y'all can say, tomatoes. It's actually from the Aztecs. Tomatoes tomatoes moved around the world due to the Silk Road, translated slave, spice. Like, that's how tomatoes migrate. Like, that's how tomatoes moved around the world. But tomatoes originally are Aztec, Mayan. That's where tomatoes came from. And originally, people thought that tomatoes were poisonous, so people didn't eat them. They used them as like flowers. Like, I want to put a pot of roses. They put a small tomato plant. They thought they were pretty, but they thought that they were poisonous. It's not an Italian thing. Tomatoes are not an Italian thing. They got to Italy, and Italy did a lot with tomatoes, but they are not an Italian thing. No. And that's also why you see tomatoes prepared differently in different parts of the world. So, in Africa, when tomatoes came to Africa, to West Africa, because of the West African preparation, the West African preparation of tomatoes is to, obviously we're using our resources. And so palm nut oil is one of those resources that is West African, right? Palm nut oil, to be very clear. And so it is the cooking or the caramelizing of tomatoes in palm nut oil, right? Shows up in Brunswick stew, right? That's why we have tomatoes in it. That's why. So, you know what I'm saying? And then you're putting whatever starches you have around potato. There's potatoes in this one. Some people put all different kinds of potatoes. But we have the Native American influence. We have the West African culinary influence, and we have Mr. Matthews, whose Brunswick stew becomes an absolute hit, in 1830 as a dish that he's not credited for. But it is one of those dishes. If you're Black, if you know some Black folks, and you ask them in your family, do you all have a tomato-based soup that has corn and a bean in it? And it's thick. It's not quite a stew. It's not like beef stew, because you can put any protein in, chicken, whatever in it, rabbit, whatever. Do you have that? Most of the time, the people are going to say yeah. It has okra in it. Most of the time, the people are going to say yeah. right? So okra goes in it. We know okra is West African. Okra goes in as a replacement for the bread to thicken it, right? My mother puts potatoes in hers to thicken it as a replacement for the bread that Mr. Matthews originally used. But this soup right here is an excellent, excellent, excellent example of the invisible labor, what happens with labor when we consider it to be beneath us, something we should not be involved, something we should not involve ourselves in acknowledging, right? And so, because Mr. Matthews was enslaved and he came up with Brunswick stew, then he was not credited for Brunswick stew. He was never given Brunswick stews the credit for it, and it ends up showing up on restaurant tables in restaurants in like 1835 with absolutely zero credit to him, with all the credit going to the person who owned him, who was Mr. Creed Haskins, who was a state delegate. Andrew Jackson, the president, sitting there tearing up a bowl of Brunswick stew. That Mr. Matthews, the enslaved cook, cooked for him at his event, and they still didn't credit him for it. And then, and I write about this again on my Substack, Brunswick stew is then shows up on menus in these early, like, I don't want to call it a restaurant because it's not quite a restaurant, but these like houses that people would prepare meals. So if you're traveling, you could go there and eat, right? But not necessarily, it's not necessarily a restaurant, but it's on the menu, Brunswick stew. It is on the menu today. It is on the menu and not properly credited. It is on the menu of Smoky Bones restaurant. If you look on their menu, Brunswick stew is on there. And I can't remember the date. It is on, hold on. Oh, here it is. 1920s. Lily Furnow. Oh, hold on. Oh, I bet you can't see it because it's a screen. Oh, there it is. This, Brunswick stew. She cans it. She shows up. She cans Brunswick stew. There's an entire, a tavern on end, exactly. There's an entire business off of Mr. Matthews' culinary innovation that Lily Furnow is selling delicious Brunswick stew on shelves and has made a killing off of this man's recipe, quite honestly. So I still have my homemaker recipes. Have to see if we did anything like this. I love it. I absolutely love it. I made a vegetarian soup with many veggies and tomatoes, corns, and beans. And then I run across you. Oh, yay. Listen, absolutely. Absolutely. It's the southern term for rice and beans, or hoppin' john, an offensive term for Black African. No, I have not. I have not heard that. I don't find it to be offensive. I don't know, and I don't want to speak for all Black people. I don't want to speak for all Black people. I don't find it offensive. Hoppin' john is I actually wrote about Hoppin' john when I was addressing the New Year's Good Luck Foods. Hoppin' john is rice and peas or rice and beans. And for New Year's, African Americans, Black Americans, we will eat these celebratory good luck foods as a remembrance for New Year's Day, which was not a celebratory day for us. It was a celebratory day for other folks, but not for enslaved African American enslaved Black folks. And so the good luck foods were there because of what was endured on New Year's Day. But yeah, so Brunswick stew being this stew that has the Native American, the West African culinary influence, and it is an excellent, excellent case study in the effects or the what's the word? Gosh, I just had the word. The phenomenon. There we go. Of the erasure of labor, because domestic labor that was done by African Americans, there's a correlation to it being a low skill and unskilled job. There's a correlation to it being a job for people who don't have intellect and don't have any kind of skill. And when we have attitudes about domestic work that align with that's beneath me. I shouldn't have to do that. Nobody wants to cook. Nobody wants to clean. Cleaning is yucky. When we have those kind of attitudes towards domestic work, we have to check in with that attitude because many times that is the heritage of white supremacy showing up in our attitudes towards domestic work because that domestic work is associated with enslaved labor, which is supposed to be invisible, right? So the attitude that shows up around, I say this all the time, oh, I clean my home perfectly. I want to be the perfect wife who, does it effortlessly and everything is always so effortless. And, I never break a sweat and I never, that is the heritage of white supremacy. Because Mrs. Enslaver didn't break a sweat because she had invisible labor doing all her domestic work. So she wants to be credited for not doing the work. She wants to be credited for the effort, but she doesn't want to do the work. You see that attitude? See the parallel there? So be very, very careful to check in with that attitude when it shows up. To say, I shouldn't have to do the work. I shouldn't have to be the one who cleans the toilet, but you dirty the toilet up. So go ahead and clean it. And put it in perspective. It doesn't make you good or bad. It's not a moral thing. But we have to check in with why we've been primed for it to be a moral thing, to be good at it, and to do it effortlessly, but not to actually do it. To have the results of it, but not to actually do the work, right? Men use it to put women in their place when speaking of domestic work. And that has to do with, and this is why I always talk about the foundations of patriarchy is white supremacy. I know people don't like to hear me say that, but it's the truth anyhow, right? Because why is that putting a woman in her place? It's putting her in her place because it associates her with having to do domestic work, and domestic work is associated with enslaved labor, right? So when people, and I say this all the time, my tan, taupe, peach sisters, right, who are trying to move away from the ideas of white supremacy, can get upset when I say patriarchy is empowered by white supremacy. That the root of that, the root of the labor thing is racism. It is white supremacy. It is not patriarchy. That is because it is not possible for a black man to be anything other than black. His maleness never supersedes his blackness. So if patriarchy is the big monster and racism showed up, even though it showed up afterward, I'm talking about how it has been positioned by those who hold power. It's positioned by those who hold power as being the root of the thing that came before it. Listen, I can't explain that part, but I can clearly explain that if patriarchy were the big problem by far over white supremacy, then black men would get all the benefits that white men get because their maleness would be enough. But their maleness is not enough. They're always going to be black men, not just men. Right? So that's why white supremacy is at the core of patriarchy. And when my taupe tan peach cream sisters struggle with that, then the thing I follow up with is, if you have to have patriarchy as the core, I need you to check in with why you need to be the gold medal winner in the oppression Olympics. And I need you to ask yourself, do I think black men are people? Do I think black men are people? Because if black men aren't people, then patriarchy can be at the core. But if black men are actual people, and this is not me, riding for, I'm just saying, like, if black men are actually people, then if patriarchy is actually the thing, then black men should benefit from being men. So the only men who benefit from being men in the patriarchal setup are white men, then it is about them being white, not about them being males. Okay. So back to Brunswick stew. If you have any questions, please let me know. Oh, it's 1:53. My goodness. Please let me know if you have any questions or any thoughts. If you want to know more about it, like I said, it is available on my Substack. If you, again, my hope is that you would share the recipe. My hope is that you would identify the the way that you can pass on the story of Mr. Matthews, the story of enslaved women and men who have done all the things but have not gotten the credit. And Brunswick Stew is one of those things that has been one of those stories. And my hope is that you will get the recipe, prepare it. Like I said, it's cooking at the elbow. So I'm doing the whole demo for you. You're right there with me. Prepare the dish for others and tell the story. Tell Mr. Matthews' story. Okay. And just, have some time thinking about invisible labor and how we bring that into perspective. I never heard of Brunswick Stew, but I am Louisiana Creole, and a lot of these facts are shared in the history of gumbo. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Gumbo, and very interesting, the roux based, right? And gumbo, because then we're talking about flour and how enslaved people showed up in the wheat production because of cotton production and how it depleted soil. And we don't hear a lot about Black folks and wheat, but there's clearly something there, right? There's clearly, and that's going back to bread. That goes back to the Homestead Act and 40 acres and a mule. All of that is all tied in together. We won't get into all that today, but absolutely, what you just said, all the things you just said. So yeah, yes, exactly. Intersectional Home Economics 101, Hillside University. Yes, thank you, Crystal. So thank you again for hanging out with me. If you would like the lesson, the Intersectional Home Economics 101, it's link in bio. Everything is there. Like I said, it's on my Patreon, but it is available. It's open source. It's available to anybody. My plan with this, and I knew on November 6th that I was going to be doing an open source home economics, intersectional home economics curriculum that I wanted to make available for anybody who wanted it. And it is available for anybody. You do not, my tiers are pay what you can. So if you need to come in at the free level, enjoy. If you're able to do one of the pay levels, you are appreciated because it's work and creators should be compensated. But it is there for anybody who wants it, for anybody who wants to engage with it. The Patreon lessons, they are actual. It's an actual curriculum, an actual lesson. Like sit down, do the readings, all the things, right? And then, Crystal, I see you doing all kinds of things. You don't have to tell me what all this means. But thank you. So yeah, doing all the things there on Patreon. If you want more information about Brunswick Stew, all of this Sweet Home Cafe's cookbook from the, we call it the Blacksonian, but the National Museum of African American History and Culture. That cookbook, and all this right here, that's the canning jars that my mother does for the soup. All of that is on my Substack. So the article is there, the demo is there, cooking at the elbow, and the non-recipe, I love a non-recipe recipe. The non-recipe recipe is all there on my Substack. So if you're looking to be like, I want to sit in class, Danita, that's Patreon. If you're like, I want the writing and like the storytelling, the historical part of it with the recipe and the demo, that is on Substack. And I will continue to do Hillman Talk, again, Introduction to Intersectional Home Economics. Here, we'll be moving into lesson 2 coming up. So I'm excited to get into that and to do some more labs for that. And do y'all want to cook together? Would y'all want to do that? I think that would be really fun. So let me know. Thank you for hanging out with me. Again, if you have any questions, just send them to me. And I'm going to go. Thank you again. Thank you. Cooking would be fun. Yes, I think we should do it. Like if we know what the ingredients are going to be, like keep it simple. We don't have to get, but like we know what everything's going to be, and then we can go through it together on like, does that sound, if y'all up for it, I'm with it. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out with me. And I will talk to y'all later. Okay. Bye.